Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the level 1 to 2 adventure Forest in Twilight, designed by Jeremiah Leppert for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my content, consider using my affiliate links for your online shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Forest in Twilight is a relatively simple, straightforward, short adventure that takes place in Neverwinter Wood, and the designer has suggested, of course, to probably drop it into your game of A Lost Mine of Phandelver or Dragon of Ice Spire Peak. I can't stress how relatively simple this adventure is in terms of its design and scope, but I don't want to say that as a negative either. That doesn't make it a bad adventure. In fact, it makes it a really good adventure, particularly for new DMs, new groups, new players who are probably running those newbie published 5e campaigns. It's very, very well organized. I actually love the way that this adventure is laid out for the most part. It's very light on art and doesn't have pages and pages of backstory like a lot of reviews. A lot of adventures that I review tend to go into. I think I've made that complaint before, where I'll be reading this mini adventure, kind of a drop-in side quest that's got just an entire page full of backstory, and then in the context of the adventure, the players don't really learn any of it. So it's like, why did you give me all of that information? Here, I almost want more. It's like the pendulum swung a little bit too far, where there's just not a whole lot of story or rhyme or reason to what's really happening here. I like the actual, events that happen during the quest, but it ends up being, by the end of it, probably kind of forgettable ultimately. But again, for just kind of a drop-in side quest, you want to have more maybe a forest-themed adventure. It would work really well, for example, if you had a druid player character and maybe it's their circle that needs help with a task. I think it's perfectly fine. So this adventure is designed for levels 1 to 2. It does have, I think, a little bit of an adventure adjustment if you're playing it at level 1 or 2. And essentially the story is, and it does have a few adventure hooks to bring you to the location, which is Neverwinter Wood, which is a bunch of a tree has become corrupted in Neverwinter Wood, and it's producing vine blights and twig blights, which are kind of monstrous plant creatures. Which I do like the fact that we get to fight creatures that you don't usually throw at low-level players, right? They're not the usual goblins or bandits or skeletons or zombies. Vine blights and twig blights are relatively new and pretty unique, I think, for a D&D 5e very low-level party to tackle. You come across, again, different quest hooks bring you there. It could be you're escorting a group of halflings to a certain location, or maybe you're following up on somebody who's been attacked by these creatures near the woods. And you discover a bunch of druids in a circle being attacked by these creatures, which is in part 1 here. And then you end up, of course, rescuing them, and then you talk to them, and they tell you, hey, there's something going on in our woods, and we could use some help. These creatures are just, coming out and menacing people, and we're not sure what's going on. So that's your quest. Very much feels like a kind of a classic MMO quest, which I realize kind of sounds disparaging, but I like... I actually kind of like MMO quest design, right? That's not designed, like, not every quest has to be this big emotional, like, I need to be fully invested into, the story of what's going on. You almost need kind of the downturn quest. And again, I don't want to disparage this for not doing a lot of like interesting story things, but sometimes that's all I want. Like, give me an excuse to go to a location, have an adventure there, and then I'm done and I come back out and go to the next thing, right? I really honestly don't think there's anything wrong with that. And I like that this adventure doesn't necessarily pretend to do anything else but that, although I will get into some complaints about how it's generally laid out. But the presentation of it, I do like. I will complain about these abbreviated stat blocks, which I find pretty odd. Now, I've always been very forthcoming about my lack of knowledge of previous editions of D&D. So maybe someone in the comments can tell me that, are these kind of stat blocks where they literally truncate everything that's not completely 100% necessary to the creature? Has this been the case before in older editions of D&D, because I feel like I've seen it done like this before. I've read through like old issues of Dungeon Magazine, for example, that had like second and third and I think even fourth edition of adventures and stat blocks, and I feel like this was kind of recognizable in some cases, but I'm not sure. Either way, I'm not a fan of this at all. I think if you're doing this to save space, like your adventure is only like 15 pages, like you really don't need to do that, or include them in an appendix at the end. And I think it's more confusing than it's worth, especially because this adventure otherwise is really, I would recommend it highly to new DMs. But I feel like giving a new DM a slightly different looking stat block that, like, yes, I can look on there as somebody who's played for years and tell, okay, claws, melee weapon attack, +3 to hit, does 2d4 +1 piercing. Like, I understand all that, and I can infer, like, the range and the targeting and all that information. But I feel like for new players, it's a little too truncated and abbreviated. So I actually was not a fan. I don't think that they look good either. I actually like the way the 5e stat blocks look. So maybe that's a big, I'm nitpicking a little bit on that complaint there, but I wasn't a fan of the way that does that. What I do like are these bullet points and the way that we get so many headings and subheadings. Like, this is the opposite of adventures I read that are just walls of text, and it gets really difficult to, parse them and understand things, and just makes it a tricky read. This is the opposite of that. This is a delightful read, makes it very easy and quick, because everything is broken up, almost too much so, to where individual scenarios are even broken up. For example, part 1 and part 2 is the same scene. It's the druids being attacked by the blights, but part 1 is the combat encounter, and then part 2 is technically the social encounter when you talk to the druids afterward. That's actually included as a whole different part here. Other parts are just exploration based, where you're, going through different environmental hazards, and coming across things that aren't causing you to roll initiative, basically, and go into combat mode. For example, tripping over roots that can dig into you, or this coral that can charm you, and then a bunch of wolves come by. I guess that could be a common encounter. Or these shriekers that end up deafening you and, again, can alert wolves from around the area. So I like the fact that it's all broken up, each combat encounter. And in fact, it even says this is this is designed for an easy combat encounter. This is a hard combat encounter. This is designed as an exploration encounter. That's actually really, really helpful for organizing it. And again, for new DMs especially, that's very helpful to be able to go scene by scene like that. And it's linear, yes, but that's fine, because the other way that this would be designed, that I've seen a lot of adventures do, is by just creating a random table. And this doesn't do that, and I really appreciate that this doesn't do that. This doesn't just say, okay, now that you're going into the forest, here's a D8 table of things that could run into the players, and now we'll get back to the action. Instead, this says, hey, here is a list of things, that we've bespoke, basically created for this adventure. And I think it works really well, and I appreciate that attention to detail. So that's a big thumbs up for me. I like the organization. I don't like the stat blocks. Also, there's a lack of art in here, which is a bummer. I could rant. You've heard my rant before on products that don't have a proper cover page. Please, please, please have a proper cover page. Don't just do this. Don't make, like, this looks like the insert. It looks like somebody ripped the cover, right off of your product. I don't care if your product is 3 pages long. Slap a cover on there. It doesn't have to be some fancy, art piece that you've commissioned. I understand people have limited budgets and everything, but you only get one chance to make a first impression, and that is going to be your cover page. So please, please, please come up with some way of putting together a decent looking cover page, because this just doesn't cut it, and the art throughout also doesn't cut it. But I'm actually not including that as an official complaint of mine, because I'm going to skip ahead to the back. Look at what the designer does give us. Full color grid battle maps. Super thumbs up from me. Always a thumbs up from me. I love that. Despite this being a very short adventure, it's 15-page adventure, we get battle maps for each of these combat encounters, and these are, what would technically be random encounters, but they are scripted, so I guess they're not random. Instead, you're designed to have each of these encounters. So this, this road outside of the forest is where you rescue the druids from and have that fight with the twig blights. And then you've got a wolf den here with the fallen log, a really fun scenario here with a giant toad waiting in the mud banks that you have to, try to cross this river. This thing attacks you. There's some flying insects nearby. It tries to grab people and pull them into the water. I love it when a fight has other, cool environmental things going on. And then, of course, the finale with the corrupted tree. So I love the fact that we got all of these extra battle maps to go along with the scenarios, because that's basically all those common encounters I described is basically the adventure. The only really interesting story beat is that one of the druids was expelled from the group for being too militant, for being wanting to basically turn against, use violence against people that would come into the forest. Whereas the other druids is like, hey, we want to protect the forest and everything, but we're not going to like attack people or something to do that. And I really wish there was more that you could do with this character. He gets a whole page of information as the hermit, and I feel like that could be an interesting twist the players learn. What I was hoping is that maybe he was actually behind it all, and that's kind of an interesting, that would be a cool twist. But instead, he's actually not sure what's going on either, and he simply is trying to also like try to figure out why this tree is corrupted and like try to take samples. The disappointing thing is we never do learn what's going on here. It just there's no purpose for this tree just randomly being corrupted, and they never do like kind of figure out what's going on. I like the common encounter for sure. There's different kinds of blights, they all have different tactics. The tree itself can grapple people and give them short-term madness. Like that's all very cool, but just story-wise, there's just no real reason for it, and you don't really get a good follow-up with the actual what could have been an interesting villain at the end, who so if I was running this adventure, I would have done that. I would have made this guy actually be behind it all, but when the party comes, he acts like he's, maybe already there and he's tracking things, and the party can like try and help him out. And then maybe at the end when he leads them to the tree, he knows like, okay, I can't take these guys on myself, but with the tree's help and with the blights we can all fight him together, like, and he becomes the big bad. I think that would be a really great twist, and for some reason the designer just doesn't go that far with it. So that would at least help explain things, and then he can come up with some way of like, yeah, I wanted to try to corrupt these trees it fits his story too. Like it's really weird that the story just doesn't do that. So that's kind of one of my complaints, is the epilogue in general is just a little too short and brief. I just feel like the designer swung a little bit too hard in the mechanical way and not enough in the story way, whereas a lot of mini adventures tend to go too hard on the story, and then that story doesn't really play into the context of their adventure. Here, I would have liked just a little bit more story, mainly in the very end, and with tying that one interesting role-playing opportunity into the story a little bit better. All right, let's go over my pros and cons for the Forest in Twilight. Pro, it has an excellent balance of combat, social, and exploration. Those are the three main pillars of D&D. That's something I like to look for with every adventure, and I feel like this does a very good job of that. There is no... Technically, it's not a dungeon crawl, but really the way it's laid out is kind of dungeon crawl-y, because it's got all these combat encounters. You're designed to go in them, in a linear order, and then you've got some social encounters with the good druids and then the evil druid at the end. And then you've got your, again, your exploration is, going through the forest and having to deal with all these different hazards. And then, of course, you've got several combat encounters. So I just think, despite it being a short adventure, it actually does all three of those very, very well. Pro, it is well organized and easy to run, and integrates perfectly into the 5th edition starter adventures because it takes place right near the Phandalin area. It uses creatures that maybe you weren't normally going to throw at the players, although I do think blights show up a little bit in Lost Mine of Phandelver, but still a good way to use them. And I think it's a very, very intuitive, easy to run adventure. I really like the way it's broken up into multiple parts, multiple subheadings. It becomes very easy to read through and understand from a DM's point of view, which is why I would definitely recommend this for new DMs. And pro, battle maps for all possible combat scenes. Yes, despite this not being in dungeons, we don't really get the dungeon crawl maps, but we do have several opportunities for combat fights, and every single one of them is provided a full color battle map. I could be nitpicking and say, well, I wish there were gridless versions. I could slap on a Roll20 a little easier, but you know what? I'm not going to do that. You gave me battle maps. We're good. We're good. We're squaresies. Cons, I'm really not a fan of the abbreviated stat blocks. I just don't like the way they look. I don't think there was necessary at all. I think the regular 5e stat blocks do just fine, and if you're worried about taking up too much page space, then just throw them as an appendix at the end. You don't have to include them in them. In fact, I would have almost preferred the designer had moved the stat blocks to the end, because I don't need to stare at those, especially because none of them are new or interesting. They're all the generic creatures. And instead put the maps up here, because then that would help make it look a little bit better, since there isn't much art throughout the entire book, and since you've got good art of these combat encounters, and you could put them in both places, put them in the appendix at the end, but also just shove them in here. You can embed them however you want, but I think that would look a lot better than these weird tiny stat block things. And the other con is just kind of, I summed up all my story complaints as just wanting a better epilogue, I think, because I think the bullet point format really does you a disservice when it comes to the story afterwards. Don't be afraid of just giving me a few paragraphs of like, hey, here's what's going to happen if this happens, here's what happens if this happens, and at the end, here we go. I like the bullet point format for a lot of these sections, because I do think it works well when you've got tactics, you've got information to give, and that makes it very easy to read for the DM. But for the epilogue, I would not recommend doing that, and I felt like it was very disappointing from an Aftermath standpoint. All right, final verdict. Forest in Twilight's easy adventure structure, intuitive layout, and perfect balance of combat exploration and role-playing opportunities create an ideal drop-in forest-themed adventure for newbie DMs. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can watch more reviews and follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel, and you can support my work at patreon.com/Rogue Watson. Shoutouts to Platinum patrons: Joe, Will, Thomas, Stan, William, Brandon, Genocider, David, Eclectic, Roleplay, Roll, Christopher, Brian, William, David, Corey, Koa1337, Kyle, Matthew, Big Nut, Greenlee, and John. And gold patrons: RPG, Papercrafts, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcus, Dead Lizard Lounge, Sam, Lumpy Spuds, Jerome, Nathan, Fast Like a Tortoise, Scott, Stephanie, Rufus, and Carolyn. Thank you all very much for your support.